6 months into our marriage, Daniel remained distant, neither warm nor cold toward me. One day, I stumbled upon a scene in his office, his female colleague lingering too close, their interaction laced with an unmistakable intimacy. I watched them for a few seconds before speaking softly, "Since you've found someone you like, let's get a divorce." Right then, his phone rang. It was his grandmother, calling us over for dinner. That night, he drank himself into a stupor, nearly collapsing into a heap on the floor. As he gripped my ankle, he drew closer, his voice slow and deliberate. "Divorce?" His gaze was unwavering. "It took me a lot to win you over." "Divorce? That'll only happen over my dead body." I had been married to Daniel for half a year, yet besides knowing he was a renowned cardiologist, I knew next to nothing about him. Our encounters were formulaic, like clockwork. 3 times a month. Once at the start. Once mid-month. And once at the end. But Daniel was undeniably a good catch: a stable job, a car, a house, savings, striking good looks, and he charmed the elders effortlessly. There was nothing to complain about. Marriage, after all, isn't the same as love. Once you make peace with that, it becomes bearable. It was the end of the month, meaning his grandmother's prescription was likely running out. I drove to the hospital to find Daniel, another routine meeting. Arriving at his workplace, I pressed the elevator button to the 5th floor with practiced ease. I had been away on a business trip the previous month and had only returned 2 days earlier. Daniel had no idea I was back yet. Through the blinds of his office, I saw his familiar silhouette, and beside him, a slender woman with cascading waves of hair. Daniel rubbed his temples, clearly fatigued, as the woman leaned in close, a smile lingering on her face. I watched them silently for a couple of seconds, before opening the door to his office. Daniel's brow furrowed as he looked up, visibly startled when he saw me. The woman straightened, picking up a patient file from his desk with a small smile aimed in my direction. "Thanks. But there are still a few things I'm unclear on. Let's set up another time." Daniel's skills are impressive, both in medicine and otherwise. How would I know if he was impressive in any way? I knew nothing about Daniel, not really. Or rather, I had never truly known him. I watched as she walked past me and closed the door behind her. From beginning to end, Daniel had not bothered to reject her invitation. To me, his lack of refusal was as good as consent. "What brings you here?" Daniel capped his pen, a spark of curiosity in his eyes as he stepped closer to me. "Your bag looks heavy. Let me take it." I frowned and took a step back. The air stilled for a moment. Daniel paused, then gave a slight smile. In the next instant, our voices overlapped. "When did you get back? Let's get a divorce." Daniel fixed his gaze on me, his usual amused expression slipping into something cold. His eyes were like pools of hidden emotion, unreadable. Calls came in on his phone, one after another, each one increasing his irritation as he hung up repeatedly. "Why?" I stayed silent. "Vanessa, marriage isn't a game. I asked you once if you were willing to be my wife, and you said yes. To me, that means forever. If you're upset about what you saw just now, let me make it up to you." I interrupted him, "That won't be necessary. A divorce will do." He paused for a couple of seconds, then chuckled to himself, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "Vanessa, you really haven't changed at all. Still as heartless as ever." I found his words strange and couldn't agree. Apart from the time I dumped a scumbag boyfriend, when had I ever been heartless? Wasn't I always rather gentle? I spoke up. "I'll take the medicine to your grandmother." Then, as I reached the door, I added, "Whenever you're ready, just let me know. We can go sign the divorce papers." Daniel didn't stop me. I left without looking back. And that was it. A hollow marriage, bound to fall apart sooner or later. After returning home, I changed into a robe and started a hot bath. I'd barely settled in when the power went out. My phone, charging outside the bathroom. was out of reach. I've always been terrified of the dark. Heart pounding, I stood up slowly, feeling around for my clothes, but after just a few steps, my foot slipped on the soapy floor. A sharp, pained scream echoed through the house. I'd twisted my back and collapsed on the floor, forcing back tears as I groped around for a towel to cover myself. Just as I wrapped the towel around me, I heard the front door open. I held my breath. Fearing the worst, a break-in? Vanessa? Hearing Daniel's voice, my embarrassment faded. I'm in here, ouch. Hold on, don't. Before I could finish, he pushed open the bathroom door, flashlight in hand, looking at me with a completely serious expression. Are you all right? I stood there beside the tub, stark naked, while he stared directly at me as if I weren't already on full display. Realizing the situation, I fumbled for the towel, nearly shrieking. My back. Daniel set his phone down and wrapped the towel around me, then lifted me in his arms. The only sounds in the pitch-black room were our unsteady breaths, echoing in the quiet, amplifying every inch of closeness. The warmth of his skin was almost overwhelming. I squirmed slightly. Could you step back a bit? The lights suddenly flickered back on, filling the room with a warm glow. We locked eyes. And as I realized my towel had loosened, it slipped further and then landed on the floor. A tense silence fell over us. Daniel's dark eyes grew more intense, his voice rough. Vanessa, you said you wanted a divorce, right? I nodded, almost instinctively. And now? I still nodded, uncertain. He rolled up his sleeves and loosened his tie, gripping my ankle as he leaned in. His warm breath brushed against my skin, and before I knew it, his lips trailed down my freshly bathed skin, pressing against me in lingering kisses. I gasped as a sudden cramp seized my lower abdomen. I pushed him gently. Daniel. My period just started. He paused, disbelief flashing across his face. With a long sigh, he accepted defeat, picking up the towel and wrapping it around me. Then, he lifted me again. Sure enough, a stain of blood marked the bed. Unfazed, he muttered, Vanessa. You have a knack for driving me crazy. His tone was different. He carried me back to the bathroom. Just call me when you're done. Or, he added with a hint of mischief, I could just wait here. I shook my head vehemently. Daniel, let's face reality here. We're about to get divorced. Settling into the chair where I usually left my clothes, he replied with a playful smirk, then, before the divorce, I should fulfill my duties as a husband. Don't you think? Hearing this, I couldn't help but laugh, utterly exasperated by his shamelessness. That night, when we finally went to bed, he pulled me into his arms without a word, holding me close despite my weak protests. As I struggled, he gently massaged my sore back, his warm, slightly calloused hand somehow comforting. I let him, for now. Over the next few days, I took time off work to recover from my back injury. Daniel, surprisingly, managed to clear his schedule enough to come home at noon to make lunch. That afternoon, I laid our marriage certificate on the dining table, hoping it would communicate my resolve to go through with the divorce. When he returned, he glanced at the papers briefly before taking the groceries to the kitchen. 40 minutes later, he called out, "Come eat." I hesitated for a moment, then responded, "Coming." To my astonishment, he had placed our marriage certificate under the hot pot as a makeshift trivet. Ignoring my silent protest, he filled my plate until it was overflowing. I focused on my food, refusing to meet his gaze. After a few moments, Daniel spoke softly, Vanessa. I continued eating, avoiding his eyes. I know you're still upset. Yesterday, that was Jennifer, an old classmate from college. She recently returned from overseas. Her father was my professor. And he personally asked me to mentor her. He seemed sincere, but I still had my doubts. So you'll be spending more time together, then? How can you guarantee there won't be complications? His eyes met mine, filled with unwavering certainty. Vanessa, there's nothing between us. I handled things poorly, and it was unfair to you. I'll make it right. Will you give me another chance? I studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. If Daniel wanted to try making this work, then I'd give it a chance. After all, I had nothing to lose. A week later, my back had almost fully healed. Daniel's grandmother called, inviting us over for dinner. Daniel promised to pick me up at 9. But 9 came and went, and his phone was unreachable. After waiting a long time, I decided to drive myself to his grandmother's. As soon as I parked, a message from an unknown number popped up on my phone. Miss Vanessa, Daniel left his phone behind. He's with me now. Attached was a photo of Daniel's profile. I hope you know your place. You and Daniel are worlds apart. He and I are the perfect match, we share the same interests. Do you two even have anything to talk about? It's best you face reality. You're destined to go your separate ways. Don't be greedy for what isn't yours. The photo angle made it obvious Jennifer had taken it secretly. I nearly laughed out loud. I was just about to fire back when Daniel's grandmother came to the door, warmly taking my hand. Vanessa, didn't Dan come with you? I smiled, shaking my head. He's busy, but I'm here to keep you company. You don't mind, do you? Oh, I adore you. Now that everyone's here, let's go in and start dinner. I quietly turned off my phone. At the family dinner, I sat beside his grandmother, raising toasts and making small talk with all the aunts and uncles. The seat next to me remained empty, Daniel never showed. Over an hour later, his grandmother answered a call. Daniel? Vanessa? She's right here next to me. She gestured for me to take the phone. Suppressing my disappointment, I asked, what's going on? Wait for me. I'll be there soon. All right, I replied indifferently, hanging up and returning to my meal, silently cursing him for being such a clueless fool. Soon after, the door opened. Daniel walked in, our eyes meeting as he came directly over to my side. Sorry I'm late. I shook my head. It's not too late. Not yet. With Daniel's usual workaholic schedule. This was the first family dinner he'd attended since we got married. All the drinks he avoided at the wedding were poured tonight. Glass after glass, he accepted each toast, his ears turning red as he downed them. Eventually, the relatives started to leave, but not before calling out, "You're nearly 30, Daniel. Time to think about having a baby. Better get to it, Daniel. We're all waiting for a cute little one soon." Daniel smiled, humoring them, and held my hand under the table, his eyes bright. Good heavens, he still dared to hold my hand after all this? When everyone finally left, it was just Daniel, his grandmother, and me. Daniel, tipsy and with flushed ears, slumped against my shoulder. I'd had a bit to drink too, and it was far too late to drive home. Finally, his grandmother spoke up with a knowing smile. Daniel's room on the second floor is ready. I even cleaned it up for you too. Why don't you stay the night? I glanced at Daniel, who was fast asleep against my shoulder in his black coat, and eventually nodded. His grandmother turned on the light for us on the second floor, smiling as she said, "Rest well tonight." "Good night, Grandma." I helped Daniel up, and we staggered up the stairs. He clutched the sweater around my waist, mumbling, "Baby. Baby. My foot." If he didn't clear things up soon, his baby was going to turn into his ex-wife. I pushed open the door, and Daniel collapsed onto the bed. I took a moment to look around his room. It was simple, with his childhood photos and high school graduation picture on the desk. In one corner, there was a violin resting against the wall. I picked it up and ran my fingers over it. The violin was covered in scratches, as if its owner had tried to destroy it in a fit of frustration. Judging by its quality, it wasn't cheap. It reminded me of a certain boy. I placed the violin back on the desk, then noticed a small box on the top shelf. I opened it and froze. Inside was a sponsorship certificate, a bank transfer receipt, and a torn photo. In the photo, a shy, gentle boy stood on a stage, playing the violin. The face was unmistakable. It was him. Years ago. After breaking up with a sleazy ex, I found out he had secretly siphoned off my assets. In a fit of rage, I took all the money he'd transferred and used it to sponsor underprivileged students, smashing $1 million on a whim. Come to think of it, I had seen Daniel before. When he was a high school sophomore, I was in my second year of college. I was invited to his school's event as a sponsor. That evening, I withdrew my funding. The principal asked me why, and I pointed to the boy holding a violin by the window. "Do you think he lacks money?" I asked calmly. The violin he held was worth tens of thousands, fully handmade, unattainable without a significant sum. The principal fell silent, and I left soon after. I donated the $1 million to support children in remote areas instead. Later, I learned that Daniel's family had indeed fallen on hard times. But by then, the $1 million was already in the mountains. So, for my remaining years in college, I saved bits and pieces to cover Daniel's tuition and living expenses. He never knew it was me. I stared silently at the violin. Suddenly, Daniel sat up, his gaze tender as he looked at me. "Baby," his voice jolted me from my thoughts. Daniel pulled me into his arms. His voice soft as he apologized, "I'm sorry, I was really busy tonight. Walking down the aisle with you, it's something I'd dreamed about for years." He chuckled softly. I stared at him, momentarily stunned, then frowned, pushing him away. "Don't play dumb with me, Daniel. Explain yourself, or this marriage ends right here." "You shameless man." He paused for a few seconds, narrowing his eyes, as though trying to make sense of my words. Then, he gripped my waist and pulled me onto his lap. "Who told you I was shameless?" I pulled out my phone, showing him the messages Jennifer had sent. "See for yourself." But in his current state, reading was clearly out of the question. I cleared my throat, ready to read them to him, but he buried his head in my hair and murmured, "I haven't done anything to betray you. I really did go to my professor's house tonight, and yes, I saw her. But it was only for a medical research topic. My professor has this rule: no phones in his study. They stay in the living room. I texted you, I called you. But it seems you blocked me." "Oh, right. I'd blocked him after my last business trip." I pursed my lips, suddenly realizing how everything lined up. "All right then, I forgive you." But he wasn't letting me off so easily. He flipped me onto the bed, pinning me down by my wrists. His voice hard and unyielding. "I don't forgive you. Leaving, just like that? Who gave you the right?" Finally, he tightened his grip on my wrists, his tone intense. "It took me a long time to win you over. As for divorce, that'll only happen over my dead body." I wasn't sure why, but hearing him so resolute made my heart skip a beat. "Promise me, you'll never mention divorce again." His hold was firm, and I squirmed in my short leather skirt, accidentally kicking something. Daniel's gaze sharpened as he looked at me, his eyes deep and smoldering. "Your period should be over. Are you sure you want to play with fire?" In love, I'd never liked being the one on the weaker side. Smiling innocently, I pointed to the black box on the shelf. "Daniel, don't forget you used to call me sister." He paused, taken aback, then hooked an arm around my neck, pulling me close. His tone low and dangerous. "Oh? Sister, huh? Let's settle this, then." "What, settle what, exactly?" I stammered, suddenly nervous. "First, your attitude about our marriage. In the future, big or small, whatever's on your mind, you can tell me. I don't want you bottling things up. Trust me. But no more talk of divorce. It's not easy for two people to be together. I want to go forward with you, but please, don't give up on me so easily. All right?" I nodded. He cleared his throat. And about the past. Running away after you flirted with me, what was that about? I was stunned. Flirted with him? Impossible, he was just a high schooler back then. Daniel smirked. You used to call me your teacher. It hit me he was right. Feeling sheepish, I mumbled, that was a long time ago. Don't dwell on it. 7 years ago, after I withdrew my sponsorship. I thought we'd never cross paths again. But life is funny that way. During his first year of college, he became my younger brother's tutor. He'd grown taller, his features sharper, his demeanor distant and composed. He was nothing like the shy, smiling boy I remembered from that stage. That summer, I was ordered back home by my parents to keep an eye on my brother, who was preparing for college entrance exams. So, it was just me, my brother, and Daniel in the house, staring each other down. I found myself intrigued by his quiet, aloof presence, pale and refined. I tried every kind of teasing, made countless confessions. But he still wouldn't like me, even keeping his distance. At the time, I thought it was clear as day 20-year-old Daniel outright despised 23-year-old Vanessa. He seemed to hate me. Using my heartbreak as an excuse, I slipped away abroad under my parents' radar. The next time we met was 7 years later. He was no longer a boy but a man, dressed in a high-end suit, his bearing sophisticated and dignified. I recalled when we were first matched for marriage. He had asked, in a cool, polite tone, Miss Vanessa, have you ever been in love? He was the last of my arranged dates, the only one who ever captured my attention. Outside, the rain drizzled. And the sky was dark and gloomy. I weighed my words carefully, finally answering, a fleeting moment, perhaps. But love? No, I wouldn't say that. So he had chuckled coldly, his tone icy, almost mocking. Well then, Miss Vanessa, that fleeting moment of yours certainly sounds cheap. He removed his gold-rimmed glasses, loosening his tie. Suddenly, he flicked off the lamp above us, his hand brushing my ear, fingers gently pinching my earlobe. The touch was calculated, intimate, but controlled. Just enough to draw someone in, to drown them in his gaze. Like waves softly kissing the rocks. But in the next moment, the intensity built, like a storm gathering. His voice was hoarse, his words a low growl, Vanessa, an apology alone won't cut it. And as he spoke, the air charged with an energy, like an army ready for battle. That night, we were lost in each other until dawn. The next morning, Daniel's grandmother came upstairs, urging us to come down for breakfast. Daniel quickly wrapped me tightly in the blanket. Help! If she saw my bare shoulder, she'd definitely suspect something. Blushing, I buried my face under the covers. Daniel chuckled softly, yes, Grandma. We'll be down soon. Grandma's laugh was more cheerful than usual. No rush, you two take your time. Take your time. Only after she went downstairs did I emerge from the blanket, my face still flushed. I looked up and met Daniel's gaze, his eyes were warm, a smile tugging at his lips. Just as I turned away, he reached out, pinching my cheek and, with his collarbone peeking out, rasped, baby. Looking into his eyes, I felt myself getting lost in the allure of him. Daniel didn't hold back, murmuring, baby. I'll be home early tonight. I was completely captivated by his deep voice. After a long moment, I managed to cool down, patting my flushed face before heading to the bathroom to freshen up. At breakfast, Grandma couldn't stop smiling. Though she didn't say a word, her knowing glances were enough to make me blush. I spent most of the meal hiding my face in my bowl. After breakfast, Daniel drove me home. Just as we got to the door, my boss called, informing me of another business trip. Couldn't he tell I'd just started enjoying a honeymoon-like life? I ended the call, looking at Daniel apologetically. It looks like you'll have an empty bed for a while. I need to go on a business trip. Daniel sighed deeply and then walked inside. How long? He asked, his tone low. 2 weeks, I replied softly. He turned and went into the bedroom. Just as I was about to follow. Thinking he might be upset and needing some comforting, I saw him pulling out a pink suitcase from the corner. He took out a few of my favorite outfits, folding each one neatly into the suitcase. Then he went to my vanity. The morning sunlight fell on his profile and his defined hands. At that moment, all his usual distance seemed to disappear as he quietly packed. One by one. He placed my skincare items in the makeup bag in the order I used them. I watched in a daze until he held up a nearly empty black bottle. "Vanessa, this is running low." "Oh, it's fine. I'll buy a new one when I get there," I replied, still taken aback. He pulled a new one from the drawer, opening the package as he spoke. "Just take this one with you." I couldn't believe it, he was so thoughtful. When had he bought this? I slowly walked over, poking his side. "Since when did you start paying this much attention to me?" He looked down, placing the cream in the makeup bag and zipping it up. "Since I married you." I rolled my eyes, poking him harder. "You used to say you didn't like me. Then you turned around and married me. And after that, you acted all cold and distant. Are you sure you actually like me and aren't just getting revenge?" He took my hand in his, sighing. "I'm not good at interacting with women, and I didn't know how to make you happy. Based on what I knew of you, if I had shown too much affection right after we got married, you probably would have been scared off. If you'd fled abroad, I'd be left waiting another 7 years. 7 years isn't something I couldn't bear, but no one has many stretches of 7 years in their life. Life is short. And I want you by my side. Marrying you was a commitment I made for life." My eyes stung with emotion, and I nodded softly. "Daniel, then why did you reject my confession 7 years ago?" "Vanessa, I have my pride too. To be honest, you didn't truly like me back then, did you?" It was true. At that time, I wasn't serious about starting a long-term relationship. I looked into his eyes and said softly, "Daniel, I'm sorry." He shook his head, pulling me into a gentle embrace. His warm voice came from above, "Vanessa, it's all right. Just promise me one thing, don't think about divorce anymore." My heart skipped a beat. "Honey, let's make things work from now on. I'll make up for the 7 years I owe you." He pulled back slightly, smiling. "Oh? You planning to wear me out?" Oh my God, what was he saying? How embarrassing. Sensing his intentions, I quickly stopped him. No, stay put. I have to head to the airport now." He suppressed the look in his eyes, sighing as he pressed a kiss to my forehead. "I'll be waiting for you to come home." Just after stepping off the plane, Daniel video called me. He was having lunch, though his meal consisted of just a slice of bread and a few sad pieces of lettuce. "That's all you're eating for dinner?" I asked, concerned. He smiled, taking another bite. "I just finished 2 surgeries this morning, barely had time to eat." A pang of worry hit me. "At least finish it and get some rest, it's not good for your health to push yourself like this." He chuckled, closing his lunchbox with a slightly teasing tone. "All right, I promise." Just then, a young man in a windbreaker called out to me, "Hi, are you Miss Vanessa? I'm here to pick you up on behalf of the company." Startled, I wondered how he recognized me. "Oh, I heard one of your speeches back when I was an intern," he explained with a grin. "I'm your biggest fan." Daniel coughed softly, raising an eyebrow with amused curiosity. "Who's calling you Miss Vanessa? How many brothers do you have out there?" Thank goodness for my headphones. Blushing, I mumbled, "No one else, I swear." The young man naturally took my suitcase, saying, "Shall we go, Miss Vanessa?" I followed him to the car. Once inside, he asked, "Are you warm enough, Miss Vanessa?" I kept the heater running while I was waiting. Unwrapping my scarf, I replied politely, "Thanks, it's really warm." "No problem, nobody else gets this treatment." "That's because you're Miss Vanessa." From the other end of the call, Daniel's voice drifted in. Looks like you're getting special treatment. Clearing my throat, I replied to the young man, well, you're very considerate. He grinned, taking the opportunity to continue. I didn't expect you to be so easygoing, Miss Vanessa. You're even a bit cute. At that, I quickly ended the call, laughing awkwardly. We've got a lot of cool places here. If you're interested, I'd be happy to show you around. Oh, that's not necessary, I should focus on work. Well, alright. But if you ever want to look around, just let me know, I'm at your service. The next few days were a whirlwind. Sometimes Daniel would call, but I couldn't answer in the middle of meetings. By the time I finished work each day, it was usually his bedtime. As a doctor, his schedule was demanding enough, I didn't want to disturb his sleep. So, we were practically out of touch. What was supposed to be a 2-week trip quickly stretched on. My business partner's polite words masked a tough negotiator who was a master at deflecting commitments, a real two-faced type. Daniel, however, wasn't one to wait around. When I finally managed to answer his video call, he was already on the ground, having flown to where I was on business. Setting aside my nearly finished work, I went to pick him up. You're so busy, what are you doing here? I asked, surprised. Daniel gave a wry smile. You've been so buried in work, you probably forgot it's almost Christmas. I came to take you home for the holidays. It hit me, was the year already ending? I've never been one to check calendars, dates aren't that important to me. So, how much time off do you have this year? Daniel wrapped his hands around mine, slipping them into his coat pocket. Relax, I've got a full 2 weeks. I looked at him, puzzled. Didn't you say you only get a week? He chuckled. Didn't my mentor ask me to guide my junior colleague? I handed everything off to her, including my shifts. That brought me a sense of relief. Won't your mentor have a problem with that? He told me his daughter has high ambitions, she could use some of these smaller tasks to help keep her grounded. I couldn't help but laugh. The mentor really knew his daughter well. That evening, I planned to take Daniel to a nice dinner. I figured he wouldn't enjoy fast food like pizza and burgers. But, to my surprise, he pulled up a map and found a street lined with small food stalls. Confused, I asked, don't you hate fast food? He just smiled. But you like it, don't you? I nodded, wondering how he knew. We ended up at a cozy fast food spot, where the place was bustling with loud, lively patrons. To my shock, Daniel joined me in eating my favorite cheeseburgers. On our way back, we stopped by a supermarket, and Daniel mentioned getting a couple of bottles of water. I noticed him lingering at the counter a bit longer than necessary. A small square box in his hand. Adults aren't oblivious, I knew what it was. My cheeks burned instantly, and I was sure my face was the color of a boiled lobster. I buried half my face into my sweater. When he returned, I was still sheepishly hiding my face, pulling my sweater collar even higher. In the elevator, Daniel looked at me, studying my reddened ears. Vanessa, why are your ears so red? Cold? He reached out to touch my ear. His fingers cold, sending a shiver down my spine. A soft laugh escaped him, with a hint of something suggestive. When we got back to the hotel, Daniel's eyes immediately went to my mess of a room, his brow twitching at the sight. It took him a while to come to terms with the fact that I'd hung 7 or 8 pairs of underwear of every possible color right beneath the air conditioner. My face flushed as I stood there, lost for words. He only gave me a teasing glance before I stormed into the bathroom, hoping a shower would help me regain my composure. After I finished, I tied my hair up in a messy bun and came out to find that Daniel had laid out a spread of food on the table. He grabbed his clothes and headed for the shower while I flipped on the TV and looked for a good movie to watch. The room was bathed in a warm glow from the lights. The opening credits rolled on the screen. My favorite foods were laid out on the table. For a moment, it really felt like home. I had to admit I was more than a little attached to this cozy, familiar feeling. Not long after, he came out of the bathroom in his pajamas and settled down beside me. We watched the movie for a while before we inevitably drifted into one of those "So, when did you first start liking me?" conversations. Daniel's answer, true to form, was both ridiculous and endearing. Gently wrapping his arm around me, he said with a soft smile, "Probably around the time when your ex tried to get back together with you." He was talking about the period when he was tutoring my younger brother. "Back then, I was basically drunk every night, sitting by your front door." At that time, he'd been staying with my family. "One night, you saw me, clung to my pants, and asked me if it was true that you had zero appeal for men or if you were just plain ugly." As he spoke, a vivid scene flashed through my mind. Oh my God. The embarrassment was overwhelming. I was going to die from mortification. I vaguely remembered trying to hug him and even attempting to kiss him. He'd pushed me away without mercy. After his rejection, I'd thrown a tantrum, calling him every name I could think of, another heartless jerk. I'd ranted, dead-eyed and dead-faced at home, but wide-eyed like a fish outside. How am I supposed to live like this? I glanced over at him, pouting. "Mr. Daniel, this is such a warm, romantic moment. Do you really have to bring up my embarrassing history? You're absolutely killing the mood." He leaned over, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "Miss Vanessa, I'm trying to tell you that even back then, I was already falling for you." "That early, huh? Guess I must be pretty special." After a while, I finished eating and went to rinse my mouth, planning to snuggle back into his arms for the rest of the movie. The moment I stepped out of the bathroom, Daniel scooped me up in his arms. "Miss Vanessa, it's late," he murmured, switching to French, "Je vais dormir avec toi." In the background, the movie played a scene where the protagonists reunited after a long separation. I couldn't help but think, with a shiver of dread, that if this world weren't so full of stories of second chances and broken things mending, the one who waited might slowly drown in endless waiting. They'd go from full of hope to utterly heartbroken, finally ending up married with kids, resigned to this fleeting life. Just the thought of it hurt. I wrapped my arms tightly around Daniel's waist. Fortunately, Cupid is a soft-hearted god, and his arrow had found its way into our hearts. After all these years of circling each other, we'd finally found our way back to where we belonged together. Side story: Miss Vanessa's husband charming attempts. You all remember how I tried to flirt with Daniel, right? Let's drop the act. I definitely did. This was about 7 years ago. My younger brother was in his final year of high school. Daniel was hired as his tutor because my parents were too busy with business to supervise him themselves. So, I was ordered to return to the country. On my first day back, I was completely knocked out due to jet lag. Around 6:30 in the morning, I was startled awake by the sound of the doorbell. My brother, Jacob, was sleeping like the dead. Calling his phone didn't even wake him. I rubbed my eyes and shuffled to the door in my slippers. As soon as I opened it, my eyes widened. My goodness! I'd seen plenty of handsome guys while living abroad, but Daniel was something else. With his sharply defined features and an inexplicably attractive aura, he stood there, his veins showing on his forearms and neck. It made him look strong and, honestly, very attractive. There's just something about a guy with defined arms and a strong neck, it's lethal. I smiled, my eyes crinkling with amusement. "Hi there." The young man adjusted his black baseball cap, his voice cool. "Hello, I'm the tutor Mr. Lee hired." He paused, then asked, "If it's okay, can we start the lesson now?" I chuckled as I opened the door wider. "Little brother, don't be fooled by my innocent looks. I'm not your student. You should call me sister, alright?" Before coming back, my parents had insisted I dye my hair back to black. At the moment, I wasn't wearing any makeup, and my bare face looked quite fresh and youthful. He lowered his eyes. I was wearing a cream-colored silk slip dress, almost blindingly white under the morning sunlight. "Sister," he mumbled awkwardly, then raised his gaze, only to meet my smiling eyes. His gaze shifted quickly, but not before his ears turned a suspicious shade of red. From then on, I found excuses to sneak peeks at him bringing Jacob fruit, water, drinks, or snacks. Mainly, my parents had commanded me to keep an eye on Jacob, so I didn't get many chances to appreciate handsome guys outside. Right in front of me, Daniel, this pure young man, towering over 185 centimeters. With that slight air of aloofness and reserve, he checked all my boxes. Boys. It's been an hour, time for a break. Teacher Daniel, have some fruit. Jacob, ever the rascal, couldn't resist and piped up, Teacher Daniel, my sister's totally into you. She's never had a boyfriend last more than 3 months. Teacher Daniel, don't be fooled by her harmless look. I dropped the fruit tray, ready to smack him. You little brat. I'd love to turn you into stew today. What does Jacob know about love, anyway? He's just a kid. I, on the other hand, wanted a lasting, genuine romance. But the reality? Either I got tricked, or I was on my way to getting tricked. Guys were either after my money or my family's assets. Daniel watched our ridiculous bickering quietly, like it had nothing to do with him. Suddenly, I lost interest. Dropping my hand from smacking Jacob, I murmured. You're right, Teacher Daniel should be careful not to get tricked by me. Daniel looked up at me for once, his gaze lingering a bit longer than usual. The next day, Daniel took the day off. With nothing to do, I spent the day idling around. On the 3rd day, he still hadn't returned to work. By the 5th day, I couldn't take it anymore. Glancing over at Jacob sprawled lazily on the sofa, equally idle. I lost my patience and gave him a good smack. Tell me where Daniel's family lives. Or I'll just tell Mom and Dad you've been lying around doing absolutely nothing all week. Jacob grumbled, attempting to negotiate. Fine, but you have to take me with you. As if I'd let him tag along and be a third wheel between me and Daniel. He hesitated, his expression oddly serious. Really? You should bring me. Daniel lives in a pretty remote area. It's not safe for you to go alone. So, I finally agreed, and we set off to find Daniel. Jacob wasn't wrong, Daniel lived in an isolated, rundown area, full of narrow, winding streets. I had no idea our city even had places this neglected. After countless sharp turns and sudden stops, I couldn't help but ask, Jacob, does Daniel really live here? This far away? You're telling me he commutes all the way here every day to tutor you? Jacob put away his phone, his expression serious. Yeah. Each way takes over 2 hours. And as you saw, part of the route has no public transport. So he has to walk for over an hour, too. I fell silent. Jacob added, so, sis, maybe you should cut him some slack. I frowned, not responding. Finally, we arrived at Daniel's cramped, shabby apartment and found him alone and ill. Reaching out, I touched his forehead, it was burning hot. Daniel forced his eyes open, his voice weak. What are you doing here? I pursed my lips, steadying him. Saving you, of course, Mr. Daniel. Jacob helped him into the car, and I drove him straight to the hospital. After that, I suggested to Daniel that he stay at our house while tutoring Jacob. His expression immediately turned wary. As if I had some ulterior motive. That won't be necessary. I changed tactics. All right, then I'll pick you up and drop you off every day. How's that? He didn't respond, just slung his backpack over his shoulder and prepared to head home. At 9:30 p.m., the buses had already stopped running. I grabbed my keys and called out to his retreating figure, Mr. Daniel, let me give you a ride. In the passenger seat, he closed his eyes. Clearly exhausted. Waiting at a red light, I couldn't resist reaching out towards his face, curiosity sparking as I traced his brows in the air. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, catching my hand midair. He glared at me, his tone fierce. Vanessa, quit messing around. I batted my eyes at him. How will you know I'm not serious unless you give me a chance? He sighed, his voice turning sober. I know exactly what I am to you. We're not from the same world. The mood in the car grew chilly, and I gripped the wheel thoughtfully. As Daniel got out, he murmured, "Thank you. You don't have to go to all this trouble anymore." I waved cheerfully. Got it. I'll be here at 8 sharp tomorrow morning. He froze, staring after me as I turned the car around. In my distraction, I scraped the rear of the car against a power pole. Watch out, I stuck my head out the window. Oh, are you worried about me? He adjusted his baseball cap, clearly flustered. Smiling, I waved, "Goodbye, Mr. Daniel. See you tomorrow morning." In the rearview mirror, I saw him watching my car until I was out of sight. But the next day, I stood him up. My best friend Jay ended up in the hospital at 5 in the morning. Apparently, a ruptured hemorrhoid had led to heavy bleeding. I was his only friend in town, so of course, I had to go. I called a car to take Daniel instead. By 2 in the afternoon, Jay was already insisting on leaving the hospital. The doctor checked him over, gave some instructions, and reluctantly agreed. I planned to head home to grab some clothes so I could stay with Jay for a few days, bringing him along on the way. He waited downstairs. As soon as I entered, there was Daniel, sitting in the living room with a cold look. Jacob was in his room, working on some practice tests. Jay yelled from outside, "Vanessa! Hurry up! I need you here." Under Daniel's watchful gaze, I went up to the second floor to grab my clothes. Passing by Jacob's room, I whispered, "Hey. I'll be staying at a friend's place for a few days. He just had surgery and needs help." Daniel's hand froze mid-grating, leaving a long, dark line across the page. He didn't say anything, but his silence was unsettling. Jacob peered out the window. "Jay is a guy? Just so you know, if you don't hurry, he'll probably waddle right into our house." I frowned. "Fine, I'm going." After that day, I texted Daniel to explain. But he never replied. 2 days later, I couldn't sit still any longer. I drove to Daniel's house. That night, the moon shone brilliantly, illuminating the distance between us with an unforgiving clarity. Daniel stood outside in a black t-shirt, his hair slightly damp, illuminated by the moonlight. The evening breeze rustled his hair. Everything about him felt distant and cold. When he spoke, his words were as icy as his expression. "Vanessa. Let's end it here. We're not right for each other." He paused, adding, "I'll finish out the lessons next week, and then I'll leave." I nodded softly. Honestly, I wasn't heartbroken, just a little tight in the chest. If it was meant to end, so be it. I smiled, nodding, "All right. From now on, we'll go our separate ways. Daniel, I think I didn't like you that much. Either." I turned and got into my car. He pressed his lips together, but eventually went back upstairs. That night, I packed my bags. Jacob had already tattled to my parents, claiming I had a crush on his tutor. So, I used my failed romance as an excuse to escape overseas. Strangely, I ended up crying my eyes out as I left. Jacob, seeing my tear-streaked face as he sent me off in a cab, asked, unusually gentle, "Did he hurt you? Why are you crying like this?" I rubbed my eyes and climbed into the taxi, muttering, "Yes, he's a complete idiot." And then, nothing until 7 years later. At 29, my parents insisted I meet the suitors they'd picked for me. But my reputation in our circle wasn't the best. Rumor had it I flitted from one male model to the next. Yes, pictures had made the rounds, there I was, holding a pencil and measuring the waistline of some blonde, blue-eyed heartthrob. But for the record, it was all lies. First of all, I'm a designer. Second, measuring their dimensions was part of the job, so there was bound to be some close contact. Somehow, this got spun into me switching boyfriends every month. Rumors are deadly. Most of the suitors came and went in a flash. Then came the last one, who intrigued me the most. He wore a bespoke suit and gold-rimmed glasses. His hair impeccably groomed. The rain outside made the mood feel unexpectedly heavy. He took a sip of coffee, watching the rain as he asked, "Miss Vanessa, I've heard about you. Have you ever truly loved anyone?" I studied his finely tailored cuffs and answered carefully, "Mr. Daniel, you must be joking." "Sure, I've had a few crushes in my youth, but nothing I'd call love." His gaze met mine, his tone almost mocking. "Really? Your crushes seem rather cheap, don't they?" I paused, a bit stunned. He clearly thought I was some sort of heartless flirt. I felt a surge of indignation and grabbed his arm. "Mr. Daniel, I don't know what you're implying. But let me clarify, I can't avoid getting close to male models for work. I'm only human, so a brief attraction isn't unheard of." "But like?" "No. Outside of work, I don't keep in touch with any of them." I got up, storming off. Only to find myself stranded by the rain at the door. Moments later, he appeared beside me, holding an umbrella. "Miss Vanessa, would you like a ride?" "No, thank you." "All right." He walked off into the rain, a faint smile on his lips. Oh, heavens, could this be any more humiliating? I thought that would be the end of it. But my mother's second round of matchmaking bombardment continued. Then, 2 days later, he called me. By Monday, we were filing for our marriage certificate. In the first month of marriage, we saw each other 3 times. The second month, I went on a business trip. The third month, he left for a study abroad program. In 6 months, we'd barely crossed paths. Honestly, after 7 years, I barely remembered the Daniel of those days. Even his name felt oddly familiar. I had my suspicions and tried subtly asking Jacob. But he said he'd long since lost touch with Daniel. I brought it up with Daniel directly once, and he responded casually, "Maybe it's just a coincidence. There are bound to be others with the same name." Half believing, half doubting, I let it go. The Daniel of back then had made it clear he didn't like me. How could he be the same man who'd married me 7 years later? Waiting 7 years for someone, it's something you only see in movies. In movies, 7 years pass in a flash. But in real life, each day and night drags on, one by one. That's why I told myself Daniel couldn't be that Daniel. If he really had waited 7 years, married me, and kept silent about it, well, I'd have to beat him up for sure. So, if you ever see Daniel with a black eye, don't be surprised. That would be my doing. Turns out, Daniel really did wait 7 years.
Side story from Dr. Daniel's perspective. One time, I was invited to give a lecture at a school. Near the end of the class, a student raised his hand and asked, "Professor Daniel, there's just a bit of time left. May I ask a personal question?" I set down the textbook in my hand. "Go ahead. Is it true that you waited 7 years for your wife? How did you get through those 7 years?" I nodded. To be precise, it was actually just under 7 years. Because 6 months early, I managed to convince her into signing a marriage certificate with me. The class erupted in laughter. I adjusted my glasses and continued. In truth, waiting wasn't that hard for me. Maybe it's because I'm in medical research. I have a lot of patience. Those 7 years, I spent my days tackling medical challenges while waiting for her to return. It wasn't exactly grueling. Honestly, I wasn't sure if she would come back. There were too many uncertainties between us. But one thing I was sure of, as long as she wasn't there, I had no plans to marry anyone else. In reality, when I heard she had cried herself to sleep and left the country with swollen eyes, I regretted it. But at that time, I couldn't give her what she wanted. I couldn't even provide for myself. To her, it might have been a whim, but to me, she stirred up my emotions for years. Another girl in the class raised her hand and asked, "Professor, since you missed out on 7 years, didn't that mean you had no foundation for a relationship?" I slipped my textbook into my bag, smiling as I answered, "That's true. We didn't have a typical relationship. So we got married first, and then we started dating. But I wouldn't recommend anyone follow my example. Life is unpredictable, and 7 years can change a lot of things. I'm incredibly lucky that when we met again after those 7 years, she hadn't become someone else's wife. Several more students raised their hands to ask questions, but I shook my head with a smile. The reason? I'd spotted Vanessa standing just outside the classroom, holding our daughter. I excused myself. My wife is waiting for me to go home and cook. Class dismissed. Taking our daughter from Vanessa's arms, I felt the little one press her chubby cheek against mine, giving me a slobbery kiss while poking at the other side of my face. Vanessa looped her arm through mine, grinning excitedly. "What were you just saying in there?" A passing student piped up, "Hello. The professor was just telling us about waiting for you for 7 years." Vanessa chuckled and warned the class, "Don't try that with your professors, or you'll end up getting beaten up." The students' eyes widened in shock. "What? The professor got beat up?" Vanessa teased, throwing me a look. "Oh, I didn't hit him. But I did bring a little one into the world to give him a hard time. See? She's working on him right now." I nodded with a smile, holding Vanessa close as we made our way out. Once we were alone in the stairwell, Vanessa playfully poked my side over and over. "Isn't that right, Professor Daniel?" How could I deny it? The bite marks on my waist were still there. Gugude, our adorable daughter, was gleefully clutching my face, drooling with every coo. "Hi, your daughter says yes." And so, whatever they say goes. For a lifetime, I'm theirs willingly.